intense security in San Francisco as President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping are set to hold a high-stakes meeting this afternoon. The Chinese president arriving in California on Tuesday for the APEC summit. Protesters and supporters gathering at the airport and at his hotel, flanked by heavily armed police. This marks Xi's first trip to the U.S. in 6 years.
It's been a while. Today's one-on-one meeting between Biden and Xi will take place about 25 miles south of San Francisco at a country house and museum. Scripps News congressional correspondent Stephanie Liebergen explains what both sides hope to get out of today's talks.
For the second time since taking over the Oval Office, President Biden is meeting face-to-face with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The president plans to address a range of issues, from human rights abuses and wrongful detentions to climate change and illegal drugs. But the top item on the agenda, resuming military communication.
We have to make sure that senior military leaders and defense leaders are talking so that we don't allow competitive relationships to develop into crisis.
Whether in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, where Chinese and U.S. forces and the forces of U.S. allies are operating in close proximity to one another, there needs to be a way to communicate with each other. And so I think this meeting is really about starting to build those muscles of diplomatic engagement.
President Biden also wants to discuss efforts to combat fentanyl trafficking. China is one of the primary sources for the drug and the required chemicals to make it. And while international conflicts like the war in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war aren't a central focus for APEC, President Biden could lay the groundwork for China and the U.S. to work together on global issues.
Can China put some pressure on Iran or Hamas to step back? And see if we can find some way to restabilize things in the Middle East. So different sides, but this is what, high stakes diplomacy is all about.
The end goal is simply to improve U.S.-China relations, and the White House hopes to do that by striking a balance between healthy competition and bilateral cooperation. Stephanie Liebergen, Scripps News, Washington.
Well, the state of China's economy is also setting the stage for today's meeting.
Zoe Liu joins us now with how that will play into today's conversation. She is a fellow for Chinese Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations.
She's also the author of Sovereign Funds, How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions. Thanks for giving us some time. We appreciate it. The narrative right now is that China's economy is teetering. So how much will this influence the conversation between these two world leaders today, do you think?
Hi, thank you, Rob and Lauren, for having me. This is actually, I would say this is perhaps the first time in the past 2 decades that China's growth momentum is on a relatively weaker foot compared with the growth momentum of the United States. Remember last year, just a year ago, when President Biden and President Xi met in Bali, at that time, the Chinese economy was still among the very fewer growth lights of the world, and expectations of the Chinese growth, especially expectations about how the ending of zero COVID and the quick snapback of the Chinese economy was very high. And at that time, Wall Street and analysts were anticipating a possible economic recession in the United States. But now the situation has flipped. The U.S. economy is not only showing very robust growth momentum, but we are actually doing a pretty good job taming inflation, whereas in China, the economy is borderline and flirting with deflation.
Yeah, it's incredible to see how what was expected has not played out, amongst economists for both countries. And Biden had said that he wanted the United States to better its relationship with China to help its economy, because we've seen as these two countries have pulled away from each other, they've struggled to replace what they usually get out of each other. So how can this be accomplished without risking our country's finances, intellectual property?
No, Lauren, you're right. In the broader scheme of U.S.-China economic relationship, the trade value as of last year is, this is about $700 billion relationship. And this does not necessarily mean it's a balanced relationship, in the sense that here in the United States, especially in Washington, D.C., Congress and politicians are concerned about our persistent trade deficit with China. So from that perspective, despite President Xi Jinping and Chinese policymakers might have the interest in advocating for expiring tariffs and the removal or lowering tariffs, those issues are perhaps too sensitive and too difficult to be achieved. But at least I would say U.S. has the interest in preventing or stop or not taking advantage of a Chinese slowdown, because a possible Chinese economic slowdown also would mean that China's excess supply may further complicate global trade, in the sense that Chinese producers might lower the export prices, which is not necessarily good news for U.S. business.
And how do you think President Biden's strategies influence how our allies conduct business with China, and I guess in turn, China's willingness to work with the U.S.?
Yeah, Rob, that's an excellent point. And in fact, this is reassuring our allies in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as in Europe, is actually what I think is perhaps a very important outcome for Biden's meeting, Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping along the sideline of APEC, because since 2017, our national security strategy for the first time identified China as the strategic competitor. And since then, the reference framework of U.S.-China relationship has been this strategic competition. And that makes our allies nervous, and our friends like Germany starting to pursue their own China strategy. And that's not necessarily in our interest, because if we wanted to have effective export controls and investment screening, we need the support and collaboration and cooperation with our allies and partners in the region and in Europe.
China may point to the U.S. for its economic difficulties, but what issues would prevent U.S. companies from conducting business with China, even if the restrictions Biden put in place were lifted?
Lauren, that's an excellent point. I mean, right now, what would prevent U.S. business executives to continue with their investment plan in China comes from two sides. One is China's increased policy uncertainties due to Chinese leaders' policy slants, such as the crackdown of tech companies, private tutoring companies, and problems on the property market. A lot of these removed the previous relatively stable and predictable market condition in China. And then secondly, rising geopolitical tensions unabated between the United States and China also increase the geopolitical risk premium for business executives when they evaluate where they want to allocate their money. So from that perspective, I think although the meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping cannot solve the structural challenges in U.S.-China relationship, at least it could put a calming effect and sort of soothing some of the business executives' concern with regard to is this the time to leave China, or for that matter, where is the so-called China plus X strategy is going to be? Like supply chain mitigation or diversification is very costly.
Yeah, so lowering the temperature, trying to lower the temperature. Zoe Liu, a fellow for Chinese Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.